It's the Criterion. It's the Criterion. Criterion. N. Project.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Criterion Project. I am Conrado, and I am here with the wonderful Rachel Wagner.
Hi,
Hey, Rachel, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty good.
Great.
I'm excited to talk about today's film with you.
Yeah. Today we're taking a trip down to Africa, to Senegal, to talk about the classic 1970s African movie Touki Bouki. But before we go into that discussion, Rachel, why don't we talk a little bit about what we've been seeing on the Criterion channel? Have you seen anything interesting?
So I have to admit, I have not been able to watch anything new in this last 2 weeks because of all the screenings that I've been going to and Christmas movies I've had to watch. But I'm very excited about the new MGM musicals section that they just added, and hopefully that won't be a temporary thing, because there's some of my all-time favorite movies in this grouping. There's Meet Me in St. Louis, Easter Parade, which I adore. It has An American in Paris, Lily, which is an underrated gem, Brigadoon, Seven Brides or Seven Brothers, Always Fair Weather. Just amazing grouping.
Yeah, very exciting. A lot of Judy Garland movies. We
Yeah.
know there's a whole section for her. And obviously the movie Judy's out, Renee Zellweger playing Judy Garland, and in the competition to win an Oscar later in the season. But if you want to get a glimpse of the actual Judy doing singing and dancing like nobody else ever could, you have a bunch of movies to take a look at. I actually haven't seen most of these movies, so I'm really excited to take a look at all this Judy Garland.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I wasn't a big fan of Judy, to be honest, but
You mean of the
Judy,
movie, not the person, right?
What's that?
You mean of the movie, not the person.
Correct. Yeah. Oh, I adore Judy Garland. But the movie I didn't love, but I love, like I said, especially Easter Parade is one of my all-time favorites. And so, yeah, I love so many of these movies. and people should definitely check out Lily. It is such it's both a really artistic, interesting movie, and it's got amazing dancing. It's so sweet. It's got it's a really sweet love story, but also very abstract in the art design, and you got a really cute song, and hi Lily, hi low.
Sounds very interesting.
People should watch it. So maybe if it's on for long enough, we can do an episode on it. It's really good.
We'll see. Yeah. So that's what I'm really excited about. I also haven't seen that many movies in the last couple of weeks in the Criterion. I've also been kind of busy with work and other stuff, but I know there's a couple of very good movies that are going to leave by the end of the month. So if people want to catch up before they leave the Criterion channel, I would recommend, there's a movie called Silent Light that we talked about. I don't know if you remember when we did our favorite movies of 2007 in your podcast a couple years ago. And it's a Mexican movie, but it takes place at a sort of like a Mennonite community in Mexico. So it's actually, they're speaking this kind of Dutch German dialect, and it's a community, and very religious and very conservative, and kind of like what happens when one of the families in that community, the man is having an affair. It's a very, very slow, very artistic, but also very well done and very moving at the end, I thought. So I would recommend it to anyone who's into that kind of movie, because it's leaving by the end of the month, so you don't want to miss it.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I remember you talking about that.
All right. Now let's get into our discussion of Touki Bouki from 1973, directed by Jibril Diab Mambeti, which is, I think, how you pronounce his name. Um, Rachel, there's a couple of reasons why I wanted to do this movie. This is
Yeah.
my pick for the week. But should we start with that, or do you want to? I saw your, was it on Twitter or was it maybe your Letterboxd review of the
Letterbox, yeah.
movie? I was going to ask you if you wanted to attempt to describe the plot of the movie, but is there going to be a challenge or is it going to be doable, do you think?
Well, so I guess let's talk about maybe our hot takes maybe first, and then we can maybe that might be the best way to go about it, because I just didn't get this movie. I felt like it, I don't know, I just didn't understand how it was telling the story. I didn't understand the narrative or what was happening, and I just felt like it was very random. And uh, I was reading on, I had to go onto Wikipedia and be like, what did I just watch? I have no idea. And be like, oh, that was the plot? What? I didn't even realize that was the plot. And I don't know, maybe I was just not having a smart day, or I don't know what, but I thought it was very muddled and confusing. And uh yeah, I I don't know, maybe, but I looked on Wikipedia and I read, and I was like, okay, I guess I saw some of that in there, but I don't know. It was put together in a very weird way, and they said that that I guess this director likes. It says through jump cuts, colliding montages, dissonant sonic accompaniment, and the juxtaposition of pre-modern pastoral and modern sounds and visual elements. So I'm like, okay, I don't know. Uh, but yeah, I don't know. I want to talk a little bit about sort of abstract film in general.
Sure.
And I think that will be a good discussion. But I don't know. What was your take on it?
Yeah, well, let me back up a little bit talking about why I picked this movie. Um,
Yeah.
well, it just coincided that there's more connections, topical, like relevant things to talk about than I expected with this movie. But my first inclination was to do an African movie just because I feel like it's such uh, underseen
Yeah.
continent in terms of movies, right? I think
Sure.
most people that are cinephiles that I know and online and etc. Very rarely do we see African movies. Very rarely are the movies, shown in theaters at all in
Yeah.
America. Very rarely are they even programmed at the more famous film festivals. Most of
Sure.
the visions that we get of African film come from, Hollywood or European filmmakers. Something like either a very romantic, sort of idealized version like Out of Africa with Meryl Streep and Robert Redford falling in love in Africa,
Yeah.
or you get something the opposite that focuses kind of like in the social problems and their like hardships and missionaries, like something like The Constant Gardener or something like that. I don't know if you've
Mm.
seen that movie.
Or like
It was
something
very
kind of
fine.
silly, like the gods must be crazy or something like that. Which is,
Yeah, although that is actually an African movie, right? Made in Africa, so that's a little
oh, was
different.
it? Okay.
Yeah. So, but that's one of the rare African movies that it actually gets seen, outside of the continent.
Interesting.
Um. Anyway, I took a what is it? A class in African cinema, basically, when I was in college, and I was really interested. Uh,
Hmm.
I was really fascinated with what I saw because it was very different from, as you can see from this movie, from any other cinema that I had seen before. We did not watch any movies by the director Mambeti, director of Touki Bouki, in that class, but we did watch some other people from Senegal and contemporaries to him, and I thought he was very interesting
Mhm.
in his style. Um,
Yeah, and I evidently he made this movie for like $30,000 in the
yeah,
screen,
very
which is
little
pretty
money.
crazy.
I don't know if you watched the introduction by Martin Scorsese that's on the Criterion channel, um, in which he talks about the movie a little bit, and he says how this was basically the director's first feature. He had done a couple of shorts, but he never went to film school or anything like that. So he was actually self-taught, and he didn't have a lot of money, so $30,000, and he kind of really wanted to do something um, without rules, right? That was just like how he saw life and the situation in Senegal when he was growing up. Um, Talking about Martin Scorsese, who's been in the news
It's
lately.
cinema.
Yeah, exactly. But also very relevant because, I mean, I have very little interest in this whole conversation that's developed around whether or not Marvel movies are cinema or not. Um, because I feel like it's not a very interesting conversation to have. But I have seen a lot of people hating on Martin Scorsese, and even though he's not one of my favorites, I do want to highlight that something that a lot of people are not taking into account is that he created this thing called the World Cinema Foundation, which is dedicated to sort of like saving and preserving movies from all around the world that could be lost to time if not for the efforts, right? And the
Yeah.
Criterion channel has this whole section called the World Cinema Project. Touki Bouki is one of these movies in which they have selected all these movies that have benefited from Scorsese's foundation and have been preserved through it. So um, something that I think is very invaluable to the world of cinema and cinema history. So
Yeah.
something to keep in mind when you make, your claims that what has Scorsese done for anyone other than himself or whatever, which I've seen a couple of people say online or
Right.
whatever. Not that he needs a lot of defending because he's
Yeah.
obviously one of the most respected directors in the world, but
No, it's definitely true. I mean, I was very critical of those statements, but yeah, there's no doubt about it that it's funny because uh that my not one of my not so favorite YouTubers, she said, oh well, he needs to start a foundation to promote independent small films or whatever, and something like that, and we're all kind of like, who's gonna tell her? Like,
yeah. Um,
so
but I was not expecting to have this connection to the movie, but I'm glad that we picked it, given that it's one of the the movies that his
yeah,
foundation
yeah,
helped recover.
that's true. It did
Um,
have good timing in that regard.
yeah. So let's talk a little bit about what the movie is about, or what you found out it was about after you watched.
Right.
Um, so it's very basically the story of these two young people in Senegal, a guy named Mori, and the woman is named Anta, and they kind of want to leave Senegal and go to France, and they have to find some money in order to do that, and they kind of go about it in not, like try to hustle their way into getting the money to travel to France. That's basically what I would say is the basic plot of the movie. But as you know, Rachel, because you've seen it, and as you can imagine, people who are listening to this who have not seen it, um, it's not a very plot focused movie.
No.
It's much more of a uh, how would you say, like much more of a collage in a
Yeah.
way,
It.
right?
I would say it's very abstract. I mean, this
Mm-hmm.
is the sort of abstract art, and I wanted to talk a little bit about something that Roger Ebert said in his
Mm-hmm.
review of a film I really dislike called Film Socialism by Jean-Luc Godard. And I think it's sort of an interesting, I think, way of saying my response to this film.
Mm-hmm.
He said that he says, this film is an affront. It is incoherent, maddening, deliberately opaque, and heedless of the ways in which people watch movies. All of that is part of the Goderian method, I am aware, but I feel a bargain of some sort must be struck. We enter the cinema with open minds and goodwill, expecting Godard to engage us in at least a vaguely penetrable way. But in film socialism, he expects us to do all the heavy lifting. Now, it's probably harsher than I would be about this film. But in my opinion, completely deserved on Film Socialism. I absolutely hated it. But that idea of like where does the filmmaker need to meet us as far as between accessibility and art, I thought is an interesting point and would be interesting to discuss with you.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. I think it's interesting that you bring up Jean-Luc Godard because Mambéty has been compared to him a bunch of times. I've seen it in a lot of writing that I've looked at in order to prepare for this. A lot of people calling him the Godard of Africa and things like that. I think if you're going to compare Touki Bouki to Godard's movies, I think it's film socialism. I think it's such a aggressive and unfriendly movie to anyone who attempts to watch it that I think you will agree that it's much more intense the way in
Yeah,
which
for
it's
sure.
hard to watch than Touki Bouki. I
Yeah,
think
it
it's
doesn't even
more.
have subtitles. He uses like this, what do you call it? This is like Pigeon Navajo, like weird. I hated it, but
Yeah. Right. So Touki Bouki, I think it's more comparable to some of his earlier movies.
yeah,
Maybe I don't know if you've seen any of like the stuff he did with the French New Wave, like Breathless or Band Apart or some of those movies.
yeah.
Which
I
I'm pretty
haven't,
sure
but I
are
need to.
available. Yeah, they must be available on Criterion channel, at least some of them. Um, and so what he was doing there was really um, doing a lot of interesting alternative ways of editing and moving the camera and the stories. Definitely a shift from focusing on the plot to focusing on some other stuff, right? And I think that's very noticeable in Touki Bouki, that has a lot of things that you said seem like digressions or things that don't have to do necessarily with the plot, where we just spend some time watching them in order to kind of like, I think, in order to get a sense of the world. I think it's important to notice a little bit of background, I guess, from what I've read and what I know from my African cinema class, which I have to admit is I'm not an expert or anything in it, but I'll give it a try. My understanding is that this sort of African cinema that developed around the 60s and 70s, it was very focused on from a social justice sort of point of view, and it's kind of like a largely socialist point of view, I would say, and kind of like as a because obviously this is in the 60s, is around the time when Africa starts getting independent. The countries start getting independence from the colonial powers of Europe, right? In the case of Senegal, from France. And there is a lot of questioning from these filmmakers about how do we make a movie that is from our point of view and not uh, that it's not totally dictated by the ways of the colonial powers that were here before, right? How do we make a movie that is truly African and not necessarily Africa seen through the lens of Europeans, which is hard when you've been colonized for a long time, because education and school and all of society is filtered through the eyes of the European power, right? So there's a lot of thinking about how can we make something different, and that's why these movies tend to have such like sort of experimental in some cases, like Touki Bouki, but then some other films are not quite as experimental, but they still have these very I don't know, alternative ways to look at cinema, I would say.
Sometimes I feel like these type of films would be better as shorts. That when you stretch it out to feature film, the experimental side of it can be hard to stomach for. But if it was a 10-minute, 15-minute short, I think it might be more interesting to me.
That's
I don't know.
interesting. That's an interesting thing. I think I have felt that before, definitely at certain movies. I have to admit, some of the movies we saw in that class, were really hard for me to sit through, were really difficult to understand what was going on. I personally find Touki Bouki fun in a certain way, or like much more entertained, just because there's so much I feel like it has a lot of spirit to it, and a lot of the things that happen are very playful, and some of them are very pretty. I think the images are some of them are very beautiful. Some of them are very
Mm-hmm.
harrowing. It begins um, with cattle being slaughtered in a
Mm-hmm.
slaughterhouse,
Yeah.
basically, which is very graphic and was very hard to see for me at least. But it's all kind of like thematically linked to the idea of this boy who is caught between the tradition of Senegal and then his idea of modernity and wanting to leave for France and changing his life and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why I have the antlers on the
on the
horns
side, yeah,
on
and his
his
motorcycle.
motorcycle is to try to make that connection between the two, because they flash back throughout the movie to the slaughter.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. Because they, as they try to find the money to leave and they're getting closer and closer to going, getting on the boat, he starts to feel this pull between his past I guess as a shepherd, right? Or, well,
Mm-hmm.
a cattle handler, I would say, and his future going away from the country. And it's kind of like this tension that I feel a lot of people in, developing countries who consider leaving for a different life have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. I guess this type of art, for me, this type of movie is art. I feel like I don't get to know the characters that well
Hmm.
because it's so concerned about imagery that
Yeah.
that and I tend to be more of a character person than a art person. But I mean, it probably also just partly comes down to what kind of art moves you, because uh like, I mean, I've been a bit of I'm known to be a bit of a Terrence Malick apologist, and he certainly has his abstract movies, that's for sure. And but I don't know, I feel like there's enough humanity in his art, enough that I connect with for whatever reason. Not all of them, but uh, for some reason I'm able to connect with that, and
Yeah.
and and then others I struggle with more, and
Mhm. Yeah, and it makes
yeah,
sense because Terrence Malick is engaging with ideas and details of life that are much closer to your experience than
yeah,
Touki Bouki would be, right? He is
that's fair.
a Christian director. He's very interested in God and he's very interested in American life,
Hmm.
and which is obviously closer to you than like this man from Senegal who's kind of wondering what his country's relationship to France is, right? Like it's totally
Yeah,
foreign to you and to me. Um,
that's true. There's no doubt about
um,
it.
yeah, I think it really should be seen. I think there's two ways to looking at it. Either you really give in into the sort of like the experience of it. I feel like I would be interested in seeing this movie in a big screen just because of the images and the sounds and just like to kind of experience it and like let myself go and see what happens, what I get from it. And the other is to really try to see it as a sort of with a very analytical eye, right? I
Yeah.
think like a lot of these movies at this time were not really um, we're more interested with making arguments and thinking about them critically than with like emotions, right? And trying to like make you feel something for the characters and that sort of thing. I
Hmm.
think they're very influenced by the theater playwright Bertolt Brecht. I don't know if you have heard of him. Um,
Sounds vaguely familiar.
yeah, so in the early 20th century, this he was a German playwright, and his whole thing was kind of like going against the traditional playwriting in order to make some plays that would be much more political and like would like have get people to come to action and really think about what's going on in the world instead of like just being caught in the emotions of the play, right? Some of his plays are the Three Penny Opera, which you might have heard about,
Oh yeah.
and also Mother Courage. He
Hmm.
did it. So he was very interested in this sort of thing. And I think like this movies that came from Africa around this time and from other parts of the world also, because this is something that it's called third cinema, I believe. It's a movement that happened around
Mhm.
that time. And I think they're following those footsteps, really
Yeah.
trying to. So, everything is symbolic and everything you are supposed to think about, like, what does this mean about
Mhm.
society and how does it relate? Like the scene where before they get on the boat, we see these French people on the boat and they're talking all about Senegal and their servants and whatever, obviously meant for us to start thinking about that relationship between the colonizers and the colonized and etc.
Mhm.
Right?
Yeah, and in fairness to this movie, I didn't do really any prep work as far as knowing kind of what I was sitting down to watch.
Mm-hmm.
And whereas I know exactly what I'm going to get from a Terrence Malick film, like I know going into it, it's going to be this type of experimentation, this type of storytelling. Like every once in a while, like his new movie, I guess, is more of a narrative, which is I'm very excited to see it. But I didn't know, and I think if I had known,
Mm-hmm.
if I go to watch when I sit down to watch those Godard films or something like I know, okay,
Yeah.
what I'm getting into, and
Mm-hmm.
I didn't for this, and I just didn't have time to watch it a second time,
Mm-hmm.
and so I think that that's probably a fault of mine, but yeah, I mean, I guess it's just a subjective thing as far as what Ebert was talking about is where does the where does the filmmaker have to kind of meet us halfway as far as telling the story versus having this kind of experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's definitely a difference between appreciation and personal preference, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Understanding what a movie is trying to do versus enjoying what a movie is trying to do is a really interesting conversation.
Yeah,
I think
it is.
it's one that can be, you know, this might be a good example to think about that
Mm-hmm.
sort of thing. Um, I have also struggled with movies like that in the past. I have to say, for me, Touki Bouki worked really well in finding a balance between me enjoying the movie and being into it and also understanding what it's trying to do.
Uh-huh.
In part because I think the way in which I enjoy it is in trying to understand what it's trying to do, right? Anything that happens, I start to think, okay, what could this mean? Does this relate to this? Or is it like about the history of Senegal? Or is it like maybe a political thing or whatever? It might also be because I had this class and
Right.
have seen some other movies from in this context and I have been exposed to thinking of in this way before. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, that's interesting. That's
I
very
will
interesting.
say, looking here at the Criterion channel World Cinema Project section, I want to talk a little bit about what else is here
Mm-hmm.
in terms, just because this conversation, I feel like it's feels more like an introduction into a different kind of cinema more than just a
Yeah, for sure.
review of this movie, right? So I think for people who saw Touki Bouki and enjoyed it and are interested in seeing this sort of thing, there's a movie called Memories of Underdevelopment in the Criterion Channel now. It's a Cuban movie from 1968 that I saw a couple years ago. It played in New York in a restoration in the cinema, and I went to see it. And it was, I think it's one of the best movies ever made, actually.
Mm.
But again, it's a very um, at times detached movie that has a lot of things going on, that has a main narrative about this guy who's kind of like his whole family has left Cuba after the revolution, but he stayed there and he kind of like just wanders around not knowing what to do, and but also jumps around into all these other things about what's happening around him and in the country. And it's a very, very interesting movie, similar to Touki Bouki in a lot of ways. Maybe easier to follow, I would not so sure. But if you definitely want something that's maybe much more straightforward, I would recommend the movie Black Girl by Ousmane Sembene, who is also from Senegal. He's actually one of the most famous African art directors. I would say he's considered the father of African cinema. And this movie is only 59 minutes long, so it's shorter, like you asked for. And it's much more straightforward, I would say. It's not so jumpy and experimental as Touki Bouki. It's much more of a following this woman who works for a white family in Senegal, and the possibility that she will travel with the family to France to work over there. And it's very and it's I think it's very good and it's very interesting, and it has all of the sort of like similar themes to Touki Bouki in a much more realistic way. So maybe something to look at some point.
What's the name of that again?
Black Girl.
Oh, great. Okay, yeah. So definitely, and if any of you have seen if you've seen Touki Bouki or any of these on the World Cinema project, that would be very interesting to hear your thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and definitely worthwhile for someone who wants to look at movies from countries that you've never seen a movie from. I don't know. That's something that I'm sometimes into. Like just the idea. I'm just seeing movies from the Philippines here, and I'm realizing I've never seen a movie from the Philippines. I wonder what that's like. You know?
Yeah, yeah. That's very true. I think that is very interesting to see and get different perspectives. And that's one of the things I like about going to Sundance, because you get these films that might not even be released. I mean, or you might certainly not even in our house, wouldn't even get an art house run. And every once in a while you find these ones that are just these crazy weird little movies from a different country.
Totally.
And that's a lot of fun to do.
Totally.
There was one this year that was wild. It was so nuts.
What was it?
It was called We Are Zombies, I think is what it was called. Anyway, and I didn't really like it personally, my personal taste, but they went for it. And it was crazy. It was very interesting. Anyway, yeah, it's a cool thing to get to see and experience other cultures. And so, yeah, I think that as far as our questions, our normal questions,
let's move on to questions.
Interesting.
Our first question is, what makes this a Criterion movie?
Everything about it.
What do you think? What would be your guess?
I mean, the style, the evidently the importance of the movie to African cinema. I mean, it's just everything about it. It screams Criterion.
Yeah, definitely. There's a history of. I mean, apparently, when it first came out, it was sort of criticized and didn't really take off because it was such experimental and it was not really like something that audiences were like ready for, or even critics back in '73. But it really gained this sort of like interest later on as the director made more movies and they started to become more acclaimed, and then people were discovering like, oh, did you know that he made this like totally crazy movie when he was starting out? And eventually it was restored by Scorsese, and obviously that's a huge seal of approval, and now it's considered one of the big African classics. So yeah, like you say, it totally screams Criterion all over the place.
Yeah, no doubt about it.
What about where does it rank in the pretentious scale?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I don't know, like a 1. I mean, it's very, very very. I mean, I guess, or 10, depending on what.
But you're saying like at the extremely pretentious sort of end
I think
of
it's
the scale.
extremely pretentious.
Yeah, I think
maybe not film socialism bad. If that's the ultimate, then it's a step down from that.
Well, if we're thinking of like pretentious is trying to do something really I don't know, really ambitious and highfalutin with your movie, then I would say this definitely fits in. I think this movie is definitely trying to go for something different and maybe difficult in its own way, right? Whether or not it succeeds at it, and it's up for debate, but I think it definitely has those intentions in mind. So I would definitely say it's in the pretentiousness of the scale.
Yeah.
Whether it's worth it is up to the person who's seeing it, I would say.
Right. Sure. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, so let's talk about what we are going to be reviewing next, just in time for Thanksgiving. We are going to talk
The
about
best,
a
the
movie of
best food
feasting.
holiday.
Yeah, we're talking about Babette's Feast, which is a movie that I love, and I'm really excited to get to talk about it with you.
Yeah.
It's a Danish film, won Best Foreign Language Film, I believe, and it's directed by Gabriel Axel, and I love it. It's one of the, in my opinion, one of the most nuanced and lovely depictions of people of faith uh,
Oh.
in uh, in a film that I've seen. Uh, the lead character isn't of faith, but the bond and the sacrifice, I guess, that they have between these various characters is beautiful and moving, and I love it. I think it's a beautiful movie,
Mhm.
so I'm really excited to get to talk about it. It'll be a fun little thing to do for the end of November.
Yeah, I'm excited. I have not seen this movie before, but I hear there's a lot of great food in it, and I do love
Yes.
food.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited about that. And I do love food movies, actually.
Yeah.
It's something that I'm realizing,
Yeah.
Ratatouille is one of my favorites. Big Night, Tampopo. I do love
Yeah.
a good
Well, and it has a
movie.
lot of angles. I mean, you could, yeah, we'll talk about it next time, but you could
Yeah.
watch it and not even think about the whole faith element, but that was one thing that connected with me. So,
Well, yeah,
yeah, I hope you like it.
we'll
So
see
we'll
what
see.
happens. The other thing that's cool about this is that Babette's Feast is what they call on the Criterion channel a what is it, a Criterion special, or I don't Criterion edition, which means that there's a lot of extras that you can watch. There's
Mm,
interviews with the director, with some of the actors, I want to say, and there's a couple of like short, like 20-minute videos about the making of the movie and analyzing the movie. So not only the movie, but a lot of interesting extras that we can talk about
yeah.
next.
That'll be good. I look very much forward to it. So yeah, we'll talk about that next time. So definitely try to, if you have the Criterion channel, try to watch Babette's Feast and let us know what you think. So that would be great. So make sure that you're following us on our Twitter account at Criterion Pod. I'll have the link in the description, so definitely check that out, and we'll try to post more on there. We're still kind of getting the hang of it, and
And we want to thank our friend Michael Lorette for the theme song to the
yes,
Criterion Project. You can follow him at michael-lorette.com. Yeah, so follow us on Twitter. And Rachel, if people want to follow you personally, where could they find you?
yeah. So you can find me at Rachel's Reviews, all of our social media, and on iTunes and YouTube, and also at Hallmarkies Podcast, all over the place. And I'm producing a lot of content in the next, both on both sides, both Hallmarkies Podcast and Rachel's Reviews, and I'm really excited about all of it. So definitely follow.
Very exciting. And you can follow me on Twitter at Coco Hits New York.
Great.
And I think that's it. We'll see you in a couple weeks with Babette's Feast.
Yay. All right. Thanks, you guys.
Thanks. Bye.
Okay. Bye.